Hi guys, this is video number 8 of Matilda, and it starts with the chapter called The Names, and it is on page 206. Here we go. The Names. Miss Trunchbull, Matilda cried, jumping about a foot in the air. You mean she is your aunt? She brought you up? Yes, Miss Honey said. No wonder you were terrified, Matilda cried. The other day we saw her grab a girl by the pigtails and throw her over the playground fence. You haven't seen anything, Miss Honey said. After my father died, when I was about 5 and a half, she used to make me bathe myself all alone, and if she came up and thought I hadn't washed properly, she would push my head under the water and hold it there. But don't get me started on what she used to do. That won't help us at all. No, Matilda said, it won't. We came here, Miss Honey said, to talk about you, and I've been talking nothing about nothing but myself the whole time. I feel like a fool. I am much more interested in just how much you can do with those amazing eyes of yours. I can move things, Matilda said. I know I can. I can push things over. How would you like it, Miss Honey said, if we made some very cautious experiments to see just how much you can move and push? Quite surprisingly, Matilda said, if you don't mind, Miss Honey, I think I would rather not. I want to go home now and think about all the things I've heard this afternoon. Miss Honey stood up at once. Of course, she said. I have kept you here far too long. Your mother will be starting to worry. Oh, she never does that, Matilda said, smiling. But I would like to go home now, please, if you don't mind. Come along then, Miss Honey said. I'm sorry I gave you such rotten tea. You didn't at all, Matilda said. I loved it. The two of them walked all the way to Matilda's house in complete silence. Miss Honey sensed that Matilda wanted it that way. The child seemed so lost in thought she hardly looked where she was walking, and when they reached the gate of Matilda's home, Miss Honey said, You had better forget everything I told you this afternoon. I won't promise to do that, Matilda said, but I will promise not to talk about it to anyone anymore, not even to you. I think that would be wise, Miss Honey said. I won't promise to stop thinking about it, though, Miss Honey, Matilda said. I've been thinking about it all the way back from your cottage, and I believe I've got just a tiny little bit of an idea. You mustn't, Miss Honey said. Please forget it. I would like to ask you 3 last things before I stop talking about it, Matilda said. Please, will you answer them, Miss Honey? Here she is, getting ready to go home to her house and wanting to ask Miss Honey 3 last things. Miss Honey smiled. It was extraordinary, she told herself, how this little snippet of a girl seemed suddenly to be taking charge of her problems, and with such authority, too. Well, she said, that depends on what the questions are. The first thing is this, Matilda said. What did Miss Trunchbull call your father when they were around the house at home? I'm sure she called him Magnus, Miss Honey said. That was his first name. And what did your father call Miss Trunchbull? Her name is Agatha, Miss Honey said. That's what he would have called her. And lastly, Matilda said, what did your father and Miss Trunchbull call you around the house? They called me Jenny, Miss Honey said. Matilda pondered these questions very carefully. Let me make sure I've got them right, she said. In the house at home, your father was Magnus, Miss Trunchbull was Agatha, and you were Jenny. Am I right? That is correct, Miss Honey said. Thank you, Matilda said. And now I won't mention the subject any more. Miss Honey wondered what on earth was going on in the mind of this child. Don't do anything silly, she said. Matilda laughed and turned away and ran up the path to her front door, calling out as she went, Goodbye, Miss Honey. Thank you so much for the tea. The next chapter is called The Practice. Now we're on page 210. Matilda found the house empty as usual. Her father was not yet back from work, her mother was not yet back from bingo, and her brother might be anywhere. She went straight into the living room and opened the drawer of the sideboard where she knew her father kept a box of cigars. She took one out and carried it up to her bedroom and shut herself in. Now for practice, she told herself. It's going to be tough, but I'm determined to do it. Her plan for helping Miss Honey was beginning to form beautifully in her mind. She had it now in almost every detail, but in the end it all depended upon her being able to do one very special thing with her eye power. She knew she wouldn't manage it right away, but she felt fairly confident that with a great deal of practice and effort, she would succeed in the end. The cigar was essential. It was perhaps a bit thicker than she would have liked, but the weight of it was about right. It would be fine for practicing with. There was a small dressing table in Matilda's bedroom with her hairbrush and comb on it and 2 library books. She cleared these things to one side and laid the cigar down in the middle of the dressing table. Here's her dressing table with the cigar on it. Then she walked away and sat at the end of her bed. She was now about 10 feet from the cigar. She settled herself and began to concentrate, and very quickly this time she felt the electricity beginning to flow inside her head, gathering itself behind the eyes, and the eyes became hot, and millions of tiny invisible hands began pushing out little sparks toward the cigar. "Move," she whispered, and to her intense surprise, almost at once, the cigar with its little red and gold paper band around the middle rolled away across the top of the dressing table and fell onto the carpet. Matilda had enjoyed that. It was lovely doing it. It had felt as though sparks were going round and round inside her head and flashing out of her eyes. It had given her a sense of power that was almost ethereal. And how quick it had been this time! How simple! She crossed the bedroom and picked up the cigar and put it back on the table. Now for the difficult one, she thought. But if I have the power to push it, then surely I also have the power to lift. It is vital I learn to lift it. I must learn to lift it right up into the air and keep it there. It is not a very heavy thing, a cigar. She sat on the end of the bed and started again. It was easy now to summon up the power behind her eyes. It was like pushing a trigger in the brain. "Lift," she whispered. "Lift, lift." Here she is, on the end of her bed, so that she's just watched it fall off onto the floor. And now over here, she's concentrating so hard and trying to get it to lift. You can see with her eyes how hard she's concentrating and focused. At first, the cigar started to roll away, but then with Matilda concentrating fiercely, one end of it slowly lifted up about an inch off the tabletop. With colossal effort, she managed to hold it there for about 10 seconds, and then it fell back. "Phew," she gasped. "I'm getting it. I'm starting to do it." For the next hour, Matilda kept practicing, and in the end she managed, by the sheer power of her eyes, to lift the whole cigar clear off the table about 6 inches into the air, which is about half a foot, right? Because a foot is 12 inches. And hold it there for about a minute. Then suddenly she was so exhausted she fell back on the bed and went to sleep. That was how her mother found her later in the evening. "What's the matter with you?" her mother said. Here she is, fallen asleep from exhaustion of all that effort of moving the cigar. "Are you ill?" "Oh, gosh," Matilda said, sitting up and looking around. "No, I'm all right. I was a bit tired, that's all." From then on, every day after school, Matilda shut herself in her room and practiced with a cigar. And soon it all began to come together in the most wonderful way. 6 days later, by the following Wednesday evening, she was able not only to lift the cigar into the air, but also to move it around exactly as she wished. It was beautiful. "I can do it," she cried. "I can really do it. I can pick up the cigar just with my eye power and push it and pull it in the air any way I want." All she had to do now was put her great plan into action. The next chapter is called The Third Miracle, and it starts on page 215. The next day was Thursday, and that, as the whole of Miss Honey's class knew, was the day on which the headmistress would take charge of the first lesson after lunch. In the morning, Miss Honey said to them, "One or two of you did not particularly enjoy the last occasion when the headmistress took the class, so let us all try to be especially careful and clever today. How are your ears, Eric, after your last encounter with Miss Trunchbull?" "She stretched them," Eric said. "My mother said she's positive they're bigger than they were before." "And Rupert," Miss Honey said, "I'm glad you didn't lose any of your hair after last Thursday." "My head was jolly sore afterwards," Rupert said. "And you, Nigel," Miss Honey said, "do please try not to be a smart aleck with the headmistress today. You were really quite cheeky to her last week." "I hate her," Nigel said. "Try not to make it so obvious," Miss Honey said. "It doesn't pay. She's a very strong woman. She has muscles like steel ropes." "I wish I was grown up," Nigel said. "I'd knock her flat." "I doubt you would," Miss Honey said. "No one has ever got the better of her yet." "What will she be testing us on this afternoon?" a small girl asked. "Almost certainly the 3 times table," Miss Honey said. "That's what you're all meant to have learned this past week. Make sure you know it." Lunch came and went. After lunch, the class reassembled. Miss Honey stood at one side of the room. They all sat silent, apprehensive, waiting. And then, like some giant of doom, the enormous Trunchbull strode into the room in her green breeches and cotton smock. She went straight to her jug of water and lifted it up by the handle and peered inside. "I am glad to see," she said, "that there are no slimy creatures in my drinking water this time. If there had been, then something exceptionally unpleasant would have happened to every single member of this class, and that includes you, Miss Honey." The class remained silent and very tense. They had learned a bit about this tigress by now, and nobody was about to take any chances. "Very well," boomed Miss Trunchbull. "Let us see how well you know your 3 times table. Or to put it another way, let us see how badly Miss Honey has taught you the 3 times table." The Trunchbull was standing in front of the class, legs apart, hands on hips, scowling at Miss Honey, who stood silent to one side. Matilda, sitting motionless at her desk in the second row, was watching things very closely. "You!" the Trunchbull shouted, pointing a finger the size of a rolling pin at a boy called Wilfred. Wilfred was on the extreme right of the front row. "Stand up, you!" she shouted at him. Wilfred stood up. "Recite the 3 times table backwards," the Trunchbull barked. "Backwards?" stammered Wilfred. "But I haven't learned it backwards." "There you are," cried the Trunchbull, triumphant. "She's taught you nothing, Miss Honey. Why have you taught them absolutely nothing at all in the last week?" "That is not true, Headmistress," Miss Honey said. "They have all learned their 3 times table, but I see no point in teaching it to them backwards. There is little point in teaching anything backwards. The whole object of life, Headmistress, is to go forwards. I venture to ask you whether even you, for example, can spell a simple word like wrong backwards straight away. I very much doubt it." "Don't you get impertinent with me, Miss Honey," the Trunchbull snapped. Then she turned back to the unfortunate Wilfred. "Very well, boy," she said. "Answer me this. I have 7 apples, 7 oranges, and 7 bananas. How many pieces of fruit do I have altogether? Hurry up, get on with it. Give me the answer." "That's adding up," Wilfred cried. "That isn't the 3 times table." "You blithering idiot," shouted the Trunchbull. "You festering gumboil. You flea-bitten fungus. That is the 3 times table. You have 3 separate lots of fruit, and each one has 7 pieces. 3 sevens are 21. Can't you see that, you stagnant cesspool? I'll give you one more chance. I have 8 coconuts, 8 monkey nuts, and 8 nutty little idiots like you. How many nuts do I have altogether? Answer me quickly." Poor Wilfred was properly flustered. "Wait," he cried. "Please wait. I've got to add up 8 coconuts and 8 monkey nuts." He started counting on his fingers. "You bursting blister," yelled the Trunchbull. "You moth-eaten maggot. This is not adding up. This is multiplication. The answer is 3 eighths, or 3 times 8. Or is it 8 3? What's the difference between 3 eighths and 8 threes? Tell me that, you mangled little wurzel, and look sharp about it." By now Wilfred was far too frightened and bewildered to even speak. In 2 strides the Trunchbull was beside him, and by some amazing gymnastics trick, it may have been judo or karate, she flipped the back of Wilfred's legs with one of her feet so that the boy shot up off the ground and turned in a somersault in the air. But halfway through the somersault, she caught him by an ankle and held him dangling upside down like a plucked chicken in a shop window. Poor Wilfred. There he is. Oh, let's see. There you can see that a little bit better. Dangling by his foot. 8 threes, the Trunchbull shouted, swinging Wilfred from side to side by his ankle. 8 threes is the same as 3 eighths, and 3 eighths are 24. Repeat that. At exactly that moment, Nigel, at the other end of the room, jumped to his feet and started pointing excitedly at the blackboard and screaming, "The chalk! The chalk! Look at the chalk! It's moving all by itself!" So hysterical and shrill was Nigel's scream that everyone in the place, including the Trunchbull, looked up at the blackboard. And there, sure enough, a brand new piece of chalk was hovering near the gray-black writing surface of the blackboard. "It's writing something," screamed Nigel. "The chalk is writing something." And indeed, it was. So hold on, let me cover. There we go. So it's starting to write. You can see it on the chalkboard. Agatha. "What the blazes is this?" yelled the Trunchbull. It had shaken her to see her own first name being written like that by an invisible hand. She dropped Wilfred to the floor. Then she yelled at nobody in particular. "Who is doing this? Who's writing it?" The chalk continued to write. There we go. It says, "Agatha, this is Magnus. This is Magnus." Everyone in the place heard the gasp that came from the Trunchbull's throat. "No," she cried. "It can't be Magnus." "It is," he wrote. "It is Magnus, and you better believe it." Miss Honey, at the side of the room, glanced swiftly at Matilda. The child was sitting very straight at her desk, her head held high, her mouth compressed, her eyes glittering like 2 stars. And then it wrote, "Agatha, give my Jenny back her house." And there's the Trunchbull looking awfully terrified. For some reason, everyone now looked at the Trunchbull. The woman's face had turned white as snow, and her mouth was opening and shutting like a halibut out of water and giving out a series of strangled gasps. She's like, Then it says, come on, focus. It says, "Give my Jenny her wages. Give my Jenny the house, then get out of here. If you don't, I will come and get you. I will come and get you like you got me. I am watching you, Agatha." The chalk stopped writing. It hovered for a few moments, then suddenly it dropped to the floor with a tinkle and broke in 2. Wilfred, who had managed to resume his seat in the front row, screamed. "Miss Trunchbull has fallen down. Miss Trunchbull is on the floor." This was the most sensational bit of news of all, and the entire class jumped up out of their seats to have a really good look. And there she was, the huge figure of the headmistress stretched full length out on her back across the floor, out for the count. She passed out, or fainted. Miss Honey ran forward and knelt beside the prostrate giant. "She's fainted," she cried. "She's out cold. Someone go and fetch the matron at once." 3 children ran out of the room. Nigel, always ready for action, leapt up and seized the big jug of water. "My father says cold water is the best way to wake up someone who's fainted," he said. And with that, he tipped the entire contents of the jug over the Trunchbull's head. No one, not even Miss Honey, protested. Here you go. Here's Miss Trunchbull on the floor. There's Nigel, probably happy as can be, to drop water all over the Trunchbull's head. As for Matilda, she continued to sit motionless at her desk. She was feeling curiously elated. She felt as though she had touched something that was not quite of this world, the highest point of the heavens, the farthest star. She had felt most wonderfully the power surging up behind her eyes, gushing like a warm fluid inside her skull, and her eyes had even become scorching hot. Hotter than ever before, and things had come bursting out of her eye sockets, and then the piece of chalk had lifted itself up and begun to write. It seemed as though she had hardly done anything. It had been so simple. The school matron, followed by 5 teachers, 3 women and 2 men, came rushing into the room. "By golly, somebody's floored her at last," cried one of the men, grinning. "Congratulations, Miss Honey." "Who threw the water over her?" asked the matron. "I did," said Nigel proudly. "Good for you," another teacher said. "Shall we get some more?" "Stop that," the matron said. "We must carry her up to the sick room." It took all 5 teachers and the matron to lift the enormous woman and stagger with her out of the room. Miss Honey said to the class, "I think you'd all better go out to the playground and amuse yourselves until the next lesson." Then she turned and walked over to the blackboard and carefully wiped out all the chalk writing. The children began filing out of the classroom. Matilda started to go with them, but as she passed Miss Honey, she paused, and her twinkling eyes met the teacher's eyes, and Miss Honey ran forward and gave the tiny child a great big hug and a kiss. There's one more chapter after this, I think, and we'll start that in our next video.